Good morning, everybody. I'm Ruth Mccallum. I am the chair of labor studies here at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, and I also teach at the Graduate Center in the sociology program. In both settings, Stanley was my colleague. So this is a very emotional day for all of us, including myself. Before I introduce our panelists on this introductory panel on labor, I'm just going to offer a few reflections of my own. I first encountered Stanley's work as an undergraduate, a newly radicalized undergraduate in 1973, when his first, and in my opinion, still most influential book, False Promises, appeared. As Mike Pellias said earlier this morning, that book, as he put it, broke the paradigm. I, along with pretty much everybody I knew, devoured that book whole. And it was transformative for our generation, both on the sort of labor-oriented left and also in academia, which at the time was in the midst of a Marxist revival and also a renewal of labor scholarship. So it was, extremely well-timed and extremely influential. Stanley, in that book, introduced a sweeping critique of organized labor, along with a deep appreciation of working class militancy. On the second topic, working class militancy, the brilliant chapter in the book, which is the first real chapter after the introduction, on Lordstown, was an incredibly rich portrait of that possibility. And I remember teaching that chapter when I was in graduate school to great effect. It was, it's one of the best things in the book, although there are many others. As you probably know, although I don't think it's been mentioned yet today, Stanley had been a union official with the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. I'm sure we'll hear more about this in a little while from our panelists. And writing this book marked his transition from that life as a worker and a labor activist and eventually labor official into a full-time public intellectual. So I looked the book over again last night in preparing for this event, and I thought I might indulge myself and read you just a few brief excerpts, because just to give you the flavor of the book for those who don't know it, I know many of you already are familiar with it. So it's just very briefly. These are both from the introduction to the book, the original introduction. Stanley writes, I came from a working class family and spent nearly 15 years in the shops and in full-time union work. Even though I never identified with the existing union leadership and always regarded myself as an oppositionist, I was a firm advocate of building unions, even if conservative, among the unorganized. Implicit in my years as a rank and file union member and activist in caucuses aimed at replacing the existing union leadership, and as an organizer, was the idea that unions played a generally progressive role in US social struggles, and that workers could never achieve socialist consciousness until they had learned how to struggle for their own immediate demands and take control of their own unions. So that's where he starts. And then he explains, this book represents a departure from these views. And a little later, he goes on to say, and this is sort of the core of the argument of the book, I think, despite its accomplishments, the American radical movement, like its European counterparts, has helped to consolidate the power of capital over workers in two ways. It assisted in the organization of unions that have increasingly been instruments for the disciplining and control of workers. And it fought for reforms that strengthened the power of the capitalist state to organize and rationalize the most chaotic features of the socioeconomic system, and so on. So that's sort of, the core message of the book. And yet, and that perspective, I want to say, has been absorbed so deeply into the labor left that we kind of take it for granted and maybe don't recall quite where it came from, but a lot of it came from this book. Stanley, though, himself as an actor, maintained a critical and yet deeply engaged relationship to organized labor throughout his life. I mean, 1973 was, was pretty early in that story. And as you'll hear more about from our panelists, And he also continued to write about labor questions, somewhat less, well, with a sort of more mellow approach, I would say. Most recently in this book that came out a few years ago, The Death and Life of American Labor, which is subtitled Toward a New Workers' Movement, and that's where the panel title today came from. I first got to know Stanley personally. I did hear him speak as a earlier than this, just from a distance, but I first got to know him in the 1980s when I spent a few years here at CUNY, but much better when I returned after a long exile in California to become his colleague, both here at SLU, originally called the Murphy Institute, and at the Graduate Center. Among other things, we had some students in common, including one of whom is on this panel. And I gained a deeper appreciation of a different side of Stanley as a kind of player within the university. So I'm very honored to be sharing this panel. I'm not going to say any more myself, but now I want to introduce our panelists. Unfortunately, one of the advertised panelists is ill and is unable to join us, and that's Adolph Reed. So we wish him well. Maybe he's watching this, I don't know, but he's not able to speak today. But we do have three wonderful panelists who will speak. We're going to start with Jamie Mccallum, who is has a PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center, where he worked with Stanley on his dissertation. I was also on the committee, but Stanley was the key player. And that dissertation became Jamie's first book, which is called Global Unions, Local Power. He now teaches at Middlebury College and has more recently published another book, also on labor, called Worked Over. He also wrote a wonderful memoir about Stanley and Jacobin, which maybe he'll say something about. I'll introduce the others as well, and then we'll proceed. The second speaker on the panel is Ed Ott, my former colleague also here at SLU, then Murphy, who I've worked closely with on various projects, among other things, a book that came out that we co-edited that appeared in 2014 called New Labor in New York. But Ed's real claim to fame, I suppose, is his earlier role as the head of the New York Central Labor Council, where he took a very creative approach to that job, including welcoming Domestic Workers United and the Taxi Workers Alliance into the New York labor movement, which was kind of unprecedented, I think, nationally as well as here in New York. And then after Ed, we'll hear from Joe McDermott, who is the co-founder and now the executive director of the Consortium for Worker Education, which runs training programs for some 90,000 workers in connection with the Central Labor Council of New York City. Prior to doing that, Joe was the education director of the Teamsters Local 237, where he collaborated closely with Stanley in developing a path-breaking union education program. So that's the plan. And each of the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from all of you. So, Jamie.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. Thanks everyone for being here. I was told yesterday there were 1,500 people registered for this event. I don't know who's out there, but well, thanks everyone for joining. Because Ruth mentioned my time at the Grad Center, I want to start off by saying a brief note about Stanley's participation in his role in my academic life. And that is that toward the end of it, literally at my dissertation defense, which Ruth was there and Fran and John as well. At the end of it, when it was done and I had passed, Stanley said that he couldn't believe they were giving me a degree in sociology because my dissertation was insufficiently sociological, which he then said was the only thing he actually liked about it. It was sort of a strange, generous, backhanded compliment that Stanley was famous for. And I've always appreciated that sort of side of him. So I want to talk, like Ruth started talking about false promises. I want to say a little bit more in detail about that book. And then I want to end by showing a brief clip from a play, actually, which I think illustrates some of Stanley's ideas really well. So false promises, as other folks have said, makes this enduring contribution to the study of class consciousness that I think hasn't really been taken up since in the same way. Maybe Mike Davis a little bit, but it's a really unique and enigmatic book. And what Ruth mentioned at the beginning, the introduction, Stanley's sort of conceit about his upbringing in the sort of socialist, orthodox, radical tradition, as he sees as the sort of pivot point in the book. I'll talk a little bit about that too. And I think that there's some ways in which some of what he says in the book sort of questions some of that original pivot. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So, and someone please, Ruth, just stop me if I go over time, please. So what is the constitution of revolutionary class consciousness? As I see it, that is a prime subject of this book. As Michael Pelias said earlier, Stanley sort of broke the paradigm in labor studies, and there's a way in which it's been dealing with some of that break ever since. Stanley's work, I think, curiously, isn't always part of the sort of canon of labor sociology or labor studies. It's sometimes, Ruth said she assigns the chapter on Lordstown. It's sometimes hard to find like a 30-page excerpt of Stanley's work to assign to students. You sort of have to read the whole thing for it to really make sense. He was a great storyteller, even in the sort of scholarly, nonfiction stuff he wrote. So I think this book has a shockingly different perspective on the consciousness question that hasn't been dealt with recently. And by recently, I mean like decades. He wrote the book in '73. And I think it's, he says at some point, the unions have all but abandoned the fight for decent working conditions. And insofar as they are perceived as staunch defenders of the status quo in terms of the organization of work, they are increasingly looked upon as enemies. That's pretty strong. Stanley was not afraid to overstate his case, but I think he meant it. And I think he earned the appreciation with this book of a lot of rank and file dissidents in the trade union movement and a lot of dissident intellectuals, in some ways for the wrong reasons, some of whom had written off the unions as incidental or as meaningless, which is not what he did. So I think on the one level, this book reads as a critique of business unionism, but it's more than that. He's saying that the interests of workers and the unions are inconsistent, which was a pretty heavy point to make in 1973, although as Ruth said, it's sort of become taken for granted, which is evidence of the mark he's made. Today, in some ways, that viewpoint is offered many times by cynical leftists who have no history at all or role to play in trade unions. But Stanley was different. He was one of them. And his criticism carried the mark of sort of like a whistleblower and a traitor all at once. And yet he loved the unions. He had nothing nice to say about union officialdom, but bottomless appreciation for workers on the line. The second thing that I find is interesting, so there's a sort of a business union critique of the official trade union movement. The second thing, which I think is the most interesting part of False Promises, is his discussion of consciousness. It's my favorite subject, my favorite book on this subject, actually. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about it. He really tries to examine the totality and complexity of the sources of working class consciousness. He says, we must examine daily life, for it is in the structures of everyday existence that the social structure is reproduced in the minds of its participants. So this is different to some treatments at the time, which really located class consciousness almost solely and wholly in the labor process. And he starts the book there with Lordstown. And I'd forgotten actually that I first learned of Lordstown through this book. I read False Promises when I was an organizer with SEIU in California and struggled at the time, which I thought was a pretty stand-up, great democratic and fighting union. And I remember trying to sort of juggle in my head Stanley's hard critique with what I thought seemed to be a pretty important organization, actually. But he starts Lordstown with the labor process and the ways in which those workers there fought for control, not just about wages and healthcare and benefits, but control over the process itself, and especially the time of the process. So fighting about the hours and seconds and minutes and breaks and the sort of quotidian rhythms of life at work, that he really appreciated that element of their organizing. And so in some ways, what I've liked most about this book is when he moves beyond the workplace to look for sources of working class consciousness outside of work in everyday life. So there's stuff on play, education, sports, sexuality, games, and mass culture. When is the last time that anyone has read sort of a labor polemic with an extensive examination of the game Ring Around the Rosie, or Kick the Can, or at one point even slumber parties? It's pretty interesting. In fact, I urge everyone to skim the index for the entry for, quote, love, comma, as play, in which part he says clock watching is a disease of those burdened with alienated labor. But he says, quote, we lose ourselves and cease to measure our temporal activity in so many time units, just as those enveloped in sexual love begin to lose spatial limits that separated one person from another. And so I think, you know, the way he invoked this very broad, non-work-centered perspective on the consciousness stuff was really interesting. His point, outside of the different thoughts on games and sex and childhood and whatever, was that school discipline, play, certain kinds of rules in play games, the sexual division of labor, libidinal constraints and freedoms, all contribute to the way that people formed their ideas about themselves as a class. And while these things do socialize working class into capitalist society, they also sort of offer these formative experiences that inculcate sort of an appreciation for non-work time consciousness. It's fascinating. It's almost like there's this libidinal drive for free time that is possibly a source of resistance to, could it be formally recognized. So in the beginning of the book, and this is maybe to go back a little bit, because I think there's some tension here. He says the fundamental question here is why the working class in America remains a dependent force in society, and what are the conditions that may reverse this situation. It's interesting, I think he starts here, because it leads inevitably to an analysis in which workers aren't in control of their own destiny. There's a normative claim that they should be, obviously, but the book isn't brimming with optimism. His debt to Marcuse and Lukács and Walter Benjamin is clear, and even Weber at times. So whereas the sort of Western Marxist canon had this sort of subjective optimism about it, Marx and his contemporaries especially, Stanley did appreciate the sort of structural pessimism of the intellect of the sort of Frankfurt School folks. Marshall Berman actually had serious issue with this trajectory, and I think it was a source of conflict for them as interlocutors throughout their lives. And this is partially why I think Stanley never fully divorced himself from the sort of orthodox socialist tradition in which he was raised. He grew up with this old-time religion, where, as Ruth said, workers couldn't achieve class consciousness without a party of intellectuals. And the work of radical thinkers was, of course, to help foment that process. But there was always a point in which they must lead. And despite Stanley mocking everyone who sort of flirted with the position, I think there was a point in which he did too, in which he was very appreciative of the role of intellectuals, and especially organic intellectuals, in sort of a revolutionary movement. And I actually wish that he would have had said even more on this, in particular on this book. It is a central sort of plot point in his political autobiography that he sort of moves on from. I don't know enough about Stanley's past and his history and his parents, but I think there's a way in which there's some ambivalence about fully moving on from that position. He really appreciated C. Wright Mills's position on the sort of labor metaphysic, this sort of over fetishization of the working class. And at times, I just think there's a real role for intellectuals to play, a central role in Stanley's work. I don't know where I am on time, but I'll just say maybe 4 more minutes, Ruth, is that okay? Something like that. So where others found that the labor process was the sort of rationale for a resistance and for class consciousness, Stanley found something a little bit different. He says the very conditions that produce an acute sense of injustice among workers also obscure the sources of that injustice. It is sort of a rehashing of alienated labor, but I think it's even a more deep understanding or a deep appreciation for the real power of that concept, that there really was, that the key ingredient in fomenting sort of a revolutionary class consciousness also was the main thing that obscured it. And that catch-22, I think, was really vitally important to his contribution to labor studies. And I think that's also why he looked outside of work to play and love and friendship and comradeship for other experiences that would foment class consciousness. As I said in the thing that Ruth mentioned, this sort of obituary, for lack of a better word, that I wrote in Jacobin, I do think that Stanley's concern with time was also central to his idea of class consciousness. And there's something that has always spoken to me about sort of, I don't know if this is the right adjective, but sort of an Aronowitzian take on class and class consciousness. And that is Tony Kushner's last play for the stage, The Intelligent Homosexual's Guide to Capitalism, Socialism, and a Key to the Scriptures. So in that play, this Italian-American dock worker from Carroll Gardens returns home to his sort of ancestral Brooklyn to explain why to his adult children that he's going to kill himself. It's an amazing play. If any of you can, there's a couple clips online, and you can read it if you buy it online. And toward the end of the play, Gus, the main character, delivers this monologue, this sort of righteous monologue, which is about labor's sort of destiny. And I want to play it. It's only a minute long. It starts after the part when the woman in the pink dress stops talking. So let me see if I can actually figure out a way to do this. Okay. Can you see that? Can someone say if they can see that? Yes. Okay, great. Hopefully this works.
I invited myself.
Empty should take her back to their place.
Empty can spend one more night.
I came to bring you fresh underwear and a bra and some trail mix, since you're the only Italians on the fucking planet who can't cook a fucking egg.
He did something utterly remarkable then, which no one appreciates. Now, no one, but it was working class guys, working class, with no politics, no training, facing down their own fears of being called bums and feminists and crooks, and insisting not merely on a worker's right to a wage, but a worker's right to a share in the wealth, a right to be alive, a right to control time itself.
So I'm not sure if that, I hope it came through. He says at the end, a right to control time itself, which really I think is a double entendre, a double meaning. The longshoremen were incredibly successful at winning holidays and time off and weekends and a guaranteed income for laid off workers. But he's also making a comment about the role of workers' life under worker control, like the future of life under worker control, the destiny of humankind under socialism. And I think that Stanley really saw an important role for sort of a temporal politics. There's a part in False Promises when he said that we've lost the ability to be a Renaissance person, where you can be this and be that and do this and do these other things. The complex division of labor makes that null and void. And I think he's doing a simplistic critique of that classic Marx idea where you can fish in the morning and rear cattle in the afternoon and be whatever, a critic at night. He's saying that's not where we're at. We can't go back to that, but we can look forward to a time when sort of a control over labor time, a control over the real experience of the day, not just the length of the working day, but the rhythm of how we work, when we work, et cetera, is really, really important. And so I'll end there. Thanks so much to all the other folks who've organized this event, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Ed and Joe have to say as well. Thanks.
Yeah, you can,
right?
Yeah, you can speak now.
Okay, yeah, well, that's a good picture.
Mhm.
Hey, Jamie, thank you so much. You were terrific. But I really want to get a clip from that play. Ed and I are talking the same way with our experiment in Astoria. We got a phrase there where the workers get together and scream, "It's not your money, we want it." So I'd really like to look at that clip again. Paula, Ruth, can you hear me? No.
I guess they can. Yeah. Jamie says he can.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm not going to do any intellectual analysis of Stanley Aronowitz's books. One, because I don't do intellectual analysis well. But I want to talk to you about the interpersonal that really might show how strong Stanley was as a presence. I want to talk about how he started the consortium. And Stanley probably doesn't tell people, but eventually I get to the point where, yes, Stanley Aronowitz started the CWE. The second is I want to tell you a tale. It's really a tale. It involves a lot of players from CUNY, CCNY, PSC, how Stanley Aronowitz got from California to New York. Then I want to talk about the fact that we disappointed Stanley. He said on a radio show, McDermott and Feinstein, their program is big but ordinary. And the fourth part then that's always bothered me because he's right. We never listened to his claim for what we call worker-centric. He calls revolution of the workers, even in unions, but certainly in community and around work, and how we're going to try to live up to Stanley's instructions with our work in Astoria. Ed and I are partners on that. You know, most of these memorials start with the fact that, well, I met Hemingway in Paris in 1921, and then they go talk about themselves. And actually, it's obnoxious as I find that, I'm going to do it. Anyway, I met Stanley Aronowitz in 1975. He was at the College of Staten Island. He had just published a year and a half before, False Promises. He was teaching at a program, a college, a baccalaureate from College New Rochelle in Vic Gopham's headquarters, DC 37. He was teaching along with Michael Harrington. We had the ability to hire, I was the dean, we could hire who we wanted for whatever course they could describe. We had Pearl Primus, the choreographer on the human body. We had Michael Harrington on urban politics, and we had Stanley Aronowitz. We had Brother John, the American philosopher. We had Gus Tyler from ILG, labor historian. And we had a good time down DC 37 headquarters. Gottbaum had built out a whole floor for us. And Stanley and I was in New Rochelle, but I come down with Cope City, come down to DC 37 because that's where the action was. And Stanley and I would go off with a few others, sometimes just the two of us, mostly to Morgan's, the pub 2 blocks away. He was a Boodles man. I was committed to Jameson, and we got to be good friends. I don't know how many people talk today. Nobody mentions this. It's very important. Stanley was good company. Well, we lost touch. He went to California, and I was fortunate enough during the process of that business of having a college and a union headquarters. Barry Feinstein, the Teamsters leader, said to Gottbaum, I want a college. He said, well, why don't you go give a call to Joe McDermott? He hired me as his education, this director, communications, all these kind of director. Finance was just becoming very powerful after his bridge strike of 73, and then his role in the bankruptcy with Gopal and Schenker. And I ran a good road with Feinstein. When I get there, though, the first thing is to take a look at our membership, city workers, some professionals, some lawyers, but mostly blue collar workers. And so we started an ambitious upgrading training program for promotions and basic skills. Stanley Ronowitz in 1981 was 1980 was on leave to teach at Columbia, and he comes and visits. And this is where he started the consortium. Jamie's right about Stanley and his left-handed compliments. He said, you know, Joe, you can be very powerful. Feinstein's powerful. You got your hands on a lot of possibilities, and you're not doing anything with it. So we went out, Boodles and Jameson that night, produced what we call, Stanley and I called the napkin. It was a Jamaican bar down the corner on 14th Street. I think we closed it, but I brought a napkin. And the napkin had 4 steps. Over later years, he would say to me, do you still have the napkin? And I'm very upset that we moved our headquarters up the block, and in the move, I lost a lot of personal files, including a special file with the napkin. But the napkin said, you ought to increase the presence and the success and mostly the credibility of workers. Start with a BA. You have to get yourself a college. That gives you, in being Catholic, I use the term, an imprimatur. From there, you go from the BA then to your workforce development upgrading training program for union members. Not necessarily under or run by the college, but because you have a college, you do other things. Lifelong learning. And you don't do it alone. It's not a Teamster project. So you gather other unions in the city into this umbrella with their members, Jane Mazer, Jack Shankman, Dennis Rivera, Bob McEnroe, later on the building trades. And they become part of your collective educating their members. The third was that, and they should be autonomous, and this should be free, and government should pay for it. It's very simple that it has to be that your members work hard, your members pay taxes, your members are part of the process, the fiber of the civilizing effect of New York, government should pay for it. Then the third was, and eventually, not a long time away, but eventually you become a school district. You say very loud and clear that the workers of this city are learning important matters. The workers of the city are articulate about keeping the city running. The workers of this city are the fiber, the statement, the spirituality of our city. And we should have our own school district that caters to, that understands, that allows workers to come and say, this is what I know, and this is what I want to know. And the fourth was, those workers never leave. Those participants never leave. Those graduates never leave. And that is your organizing tool, the alumni of the school district that has a college for workers. That becomes your arm to then have them become more powerful. You use the word powerful, I use the word articulate at this point. So go through the 4 pieces. I followed those 4 pieces. Feinstein knew about the 4 pieces. He wanted his college. He wanted to bring his colleagues, labor, friends into this umbrella for educating their members, upgrading their members. The school district is a little far-fetched, but we started going back to the state, who was giving us large amounts of money. and said, okay, this is what we want. I want to become our own school district. And we tried that for 2 years and they said no, but they created legislation. Only 5 years after Stanley, they created legislation where the CWE is guaranteed a percentage of school aid that goes to the Board of Education. I wish we had become a school district. I wish we can become a school district. All right, so then Stanley threw himself, myself, the great Ed Quinn from CCNY, the Shakespeare Encyclopedia author, and a few others from CCNY got together again in a bar. It's always a great place. It's time the Lions in. They had started a small program for government workers down in 26 Federal Plaza, and they were interested in expanding it. There was a fellow named Steve Lieberstein. When we come to them with a college in Teamster headquarters, a sizable college, paid for by the government, added to the community budget, they became very interested. And it was lucky because they were changing presidents, and the interim president, a very nice guy named Ryan, was in China. And so Quinn and his buddies from the English department had a kind of control around the Senate, figured they could get many things from the Senate. And Stanley Rodowitz, Joe McDermott, Fred Dunn from the Teamsters, a fellow named Dennis Walsh, sat across the table, and I don't know if this happens very often, from the university and negotiated a 4-year baccalaureate. We wrote it up. Now, we weren't alone in this. It's just not a bunch of friends hanging out the Lions set. This had the support, finally, of Erwin Polisher, and he was a strong supporter of the interim and wonderful guy, Leon Goldstein, was the interim chancellor, soon to be replaced by Joe Murphy. And the player that got all of the pieces together was Julia C.C. Edelstein. On our side, we had Feinstein, and we had some powerful labor leaders say, yeah, we want this. And Robert Kibbe, came to the Teamster headquarters in our boardroom with 6 other union heads saying, we want this college for our members. Tied to that was Stanley Aronowitz at Columbia on leave from California. Tied to this whole process was that Aronowitz would become a tenured professor in the CCNY Center for Work Education Baccalaureate. Later on, he had to work around money, that kind of thing, and Stanley Edelstein went to Brzezinski at graduate school and got Stanley a second appointment there. That college for city workers, Teamsters, middle-level management from the Housing Authority, a brand new floor that Feinstein built, became something that we thought we could build on. And we were wrong. We weren't able to. As is the nature of the academy, it holds its own piece together. It doesn't have many visitors and certainly doesn't take parts. So while we started it and we had expressive commentaries and why it was needed and apply them with political power, and Stanley basically not nagging me, but being disappointed in the first 2 years as he finally moves over to graduate school full time when they offered him a course, Introduction to Labor Studies or some shit like that. But during that time, Brooklyn College, Larry Musiolo, a name you might remember, was vice president. He said, what about us? And so we got a master's out of it for New York City public policy that lived for 30 years until the thugs at 80th Street sent their police down to clean out Joe Wilson's and the Joe Wilson losing the chairmanship on the right side of that political science department, attacked him, false accusations. It's a sad story, but it was a great program for 30 years. The 1707, the daycare union, classes in there for a BED for their members. So it had pieces, it had nice things. It goes over, you go where and you say, this was successful. This was That was great. It's so innovative, but it doesn't live up to Stanley's statements. And Jamie, you said so many important things that remind me of what has bothered me over these years. Did I say before? I don't remember. Stanley said on a radio show, I don't remember the year, but on a radio show, how they come to talk about workforce development because nobody does. Yeah, there's a CWA, it's Feinstein, it's McDermott. They're big, but they're very ordinary. And Barry Feinstein got upset. He's my favorite professor, was insulting us, but being a Teamster used to be insulted. I called Stanley, he says, yeah, well, I haven't talked to you in a while. I thought this would get your attention. But he was serious. So I owe him for making me, if not powerful, but certainly important and successful in my little world of workforce development and the union world. They're all grateful for the money, many millions of dollars we give them for their members. And the community world, we give millions of dollars for Henry Street and Sobro and provide resources for training and placement. But we never got to, and I had a session, I never got to Stanley's demand. I never got the reality of workers organizing around their learning and their expectations. And I have no right, I have no right to be treated this way. I hope for promotion. I just got laid or furloughed. I can't make it on this money. I'm not sure about my future in terms of these job losses. Suddenly a misclassified 1099. What does that do to me? In terms of, took my stomach away. It's not just the money and the seniority and the rights that come with a collective bargaining agreement or with a permanent W-2. I'm now cast out. So in 95, what is it? The jobless future. 1995. He was so far ahead of his game with Bill Fazio. And here's where he has his second major influence on me and kindness towards what I hope to be a somewhat successful career as a worker representative. That book was about technology in science and technology and technicians and science, and it was brought up DC 37 by Lou Albano and says, I have the tech guild. I want to know what's going to happen to us with all these machines. So that produced that book. But I didn't see all of that. And I didn't see all your Marxist commentaries. I saw one thing. We are really screwed. In 1995, we were really screwed. So I go, he's giving a talk at DC 37. And we got together and I went down. It's classic Stanley. Ed tells a story about it. Ed silly went into some room and within 15 minutes, he insulted everybody. But here he is with 150 members of DC 37. And he's talking about the end of work. Now, he didn't get into the high level machines and technology or engineering, or what role do teachers have with all the other commentaries in the book. He kind of simply says, in 10 years, there will be no jobs for clericals. Stanley, there's a guy in the audience named Al Diop. He represents 23,000 clericals. It can't be true, Stanley. It can't happen. What are you talking about? 1995, as it all goes on in the mechanical Turk, the TaskRabbit, the apps, the employment apps, and constantly during that book is constantly the loss of jobs, the loss of jobs, the loss of jobs. It's 20 years later with Steve Hill and Raw Deal that we get the day-to-day plan about one title after another, one job after another, and what are you going to do about it with the loss of employment and the picking up of this lonely worker by the mechanical Turk, and everybody starts writing then about you can't make it as a gig. That becomes, thank you, Stanley, because that becomes what we at CWE brought into our attention, brought into not just the legal questions of misclassified 1099s, the harder question of what does a gig worker do? How does a gig worker make? And then, of course, you know, around the country, 5 years later, the employer versus contract worker battle. But for us, it was, we have to find a place to take a closer look. Can a worker compete with TaskRabbit? Can a gig worker be organized? Now, the freelancers, insurance, it's a great idea, but they're not organized. In a sense, they're not organized. Can the gig workers cut off in the sector where there's a job loss? And we know so much more about it. You're not going back to the airlines, 23,000 not going back. Hospitality, 16,000 not going back. Regional workers not
No,
going back.
you need to wrap up. We're running out of time for your part of it. I'm sorry.
That's 15 minutes.
20, actually.
I'm just starting.
Well,
Well, no,
I'm sorry,
I-
but why don't you make a couple final remarks and then we need
I'll
to
make
move
one
on.
final remark. My gratitude to Stanley on this whole question, what becomes the gig worker, is to encourage us further. Ed and I have organized the town of Astoria. And we've got partners in that town. And we have partners who place workers and educate workers. And we have serious help from, and we're getting serious help from the PSC. We want to create a way where workers organize in sectors around skills, become articulate for each other. And then we want to create a way for workers co-op, kind of Modrigan of Astoria. We want to increase the power of workers to control their own, what Jamie said in that script. Thank you. And thank you, Stanley. It was good company.
Thank you, Joe, very much. There was a lot of inside baseball in that talk for people not in the New York labor world, but hopefully you got the basic.
I don't care about the others.
Thank you. And so we're going to move on to Ed on in just a moment. I just want to encourage people listening to put questions in the chat, in the Q&A, so that we'll have a chance to respond to, so the panelists will have a chance to respond to those after Ed speaks. So take it away, Ed Ott.
Thanks, Ruth. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try to be brief because I really want to hear questions. I had hoped this would be live because this kind of thing where we're talking about Stanley as a person, as his work and his contribution, this should have been in a raucous hall where we're yelling at each other and arguing the points. So this is a cold medium. I hate it. But I want to just go back to some of to what Jamie was talking about. I first come across Stanley and his work and him as a person during this false promises period. I was taking a class down at what became the Empire State Labor Program, and the students, the student council, had organized a weekend conference on questions before labor. You have to understand that some of those, that student council was some of the most powerful labor leaders in the city, and that conference got away from them. We had people in there, Alice Kessler Harris, I think, was there, Montgomery was there, David Montgomery, many of you know his work. The guy named Radek out of Rochester, who at the time was pretty controversial, and then there was Stanley. And Stanley, and this is just my personal thing, the thing I loved about Stanley from the first time I saw him, he could piss off a room of labor activists and labor leaders faster than anybody I knew. As soon as he opened his mouth, everybody had their back to the wall because he challenged their assumptions from the moment he opened his mouth. And I always respected that about him. And he did it in the nicest way. He never MF'd anybody in a meeting. But he had written this book in a period that I want to describe because some of us who are of a certain age, we lived through this period. I was a labor activist from the late 60s on. Stanley was kind of our senior. He was a guy who had already 15 years experience in the labor movement. We both shared some time in the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, me after him. And him and a guy named Tony Mazzocchi constantly talked about the phase of the labor movement to do anything but be the last prop under capitalism. But this period, you have to think about this. This is the decade after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Large elements of the white population and the white working class were absolutely terrified of this new emerging power. of Black voters. And in every industrial union in this country, there was an organized opposition. The women's movement was emerging into its next and most powerful phase since the suffragette movement. And the gay rights movement was emerging. All of these movements had wrapped themselves in the language of the civil rights movement. Everybody was asserting their right to fairness and equality. But inside the trade union leadership, several speakers today have spoken about how the labor movement did not challenge capital. They did not challenge their right to control the workplace. In truth, in the broader realm, and which Stanley understood, was it wasn't that they didn't just challenge them there. They were actually supportive of US capital in total, and saw themselves in alliance with US capital. And in that sense, the betrayal was not partial, the betrayal was complete and total. They were subservient to the truth is, to 10 years after the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, the trade union leadership missed the moment to do something different because they still thought they were in this alliance with US capital and couldn't support basic reforms. To this day, we do a half-ass support of voting rights because they're afraid to challenge the power of capital, if you will, even though they now recognize that capital's finally they recognize. They're not interested in an alliance with any sector of the working class. They believe they have everything they need structurally to control us. The other thing that I would say is Stanley was equally hard on those opposition caucuses and the oppositions to the reform efforts inside the unions, and constantly posed the questions through the 70s, 80s, into the 90s of, and he said it to my face, Ed, okay, so you're in there. If you got it, what are you gonna do differently? It's a question I walk around to this day trying to answer. Tony Mazzocchi shared the same thing. Mazzocchi and Aronowitz both said in the late 70s and early 80s that the danger for the US labor movement, for the trade union, was that they would walk backwards into the 21st century. At the time of false promises, all the labor leadership was talking about how the jobs would come back with the economy. Our favorite target in those days was President Jimmy Carter. He destroyed the economy, he destroyed the industrial bullshit. Capital had its own agenda, was going where it was going to go. But they were telling workers that this will all come back with the economy as a way of trying to hold off their internal political oppositions. But the truth of the matter was those jobs were never coming back then. Stanley's great contribution was that he was always 25 years ahead of us. He was a guy who was talking about that these jobs are not coming back before anybody else was. He was the guy that was anticipating, with others like DeFazio, challenging where this technology was in fact going to take us. He actually posed the question in his writings and publicly about the nature of work and how we would have to even change what we would consider work as we went forward, because a lot of the work that we knew existed at that moment wasn't going to exist in the future. The real question for me, and hearing Brother West talk this morning, my heart was pounding. One, because I had to look up about 200 words, but the other part of it was that he really, in his own way, without having to directly say it, for us in the union movement, he answered the question of why Stanley couldn't survive in the trade union movement as a trade unionist. In fact, it's a miracle that Stanley remained loyal to that movement because as part of their alliance with capital, inside the labor movement, they developed a strong anti-intellectualism to the point that ideas made you seditious and new ideas made you deadly seditious. It's to our shame that the organized component of the working class, the most organized component of the working class at that time, could not find a place to keep Stanley in leadership. to keep him as even the house bard, if you will. There was no ability to do that. The mere fact that he could go to a conference and say the word working class would put trade union leaders back to the wall. He must be a communist. They didn't attempt to try to understand me. The other thing that I want to say about Stanley, and this is something, when I was teaching at what's now SLU, and it was the Murphy Institute, one night when I was there for a meeting, I wasn't teaching, I walked down the hall, and Stanley is teaching a class. And as I'm walking past the class the first time, he's talking about some obscure strike that happened to be taking place out in the Midwest. I go to the men's room, I come back. As I'm walking back, he's linking this strike to the French Revolution. And that was so Stanley. And what I wanted to do at that point was quit my faculty job and go take his class. He was constantly putting pieces together that on the surface of it, particularly to students who were engaging labor ideas for the first time, they were finding out as they came to our program from different unions that there was a hell of a lot more to the labor movement than their grievance procedure and their contract. And Stanley's contribution to that was enormous. As a teacher, he was entertaining, but he was rigorous. He challenged their assumptions in the classroom, and he respected them enough that they could have their own ideas, their assumptions assaulted without feeling like they were being assaulted. And we should give him great respect for his contribution to continue to teach, which is, in my view, one of the hardest jobs in America. He always talked about being a professor is the greatest job in America. It is, but it's not easy. And when you have to teach, you can be a hack or you can be a teacher. And he chose to be a real teacher. And I just wanted to give him a lot of that. The important thing about Stanley in terms of false promises and his work on labor that came after that, and he stayed with that work. He never abandoned the struggle to try to make the working class unions better. He never abandoned the commitment to understand that we needed an organized component, what it should look like, what are the issues it should engage. If anything, he was our Renaissance man. But the union movement itself, they couldn't hold him. He was too much of a volcano, if you will. But he respected us enough to continue to critique us, to continue to criticize us. And he respected us enough to understand that at some point, elements of the trade union movement would be part of whatever working class change would come. Not in total, he wasn't naive, but he knew that some of these struggles would finally catch on and we would figure out what was new. I always used to start my class by saying, if there was one right way to do this stuff, my labor classes, if there was one right way to do this stuff, we would probably have figured it out and be doing it. But Stanley committed himself and his work to trying to figure that out. Lastly, and I want to return to something else that came on. There were other movements. And Stanley understood a lot of those movements, and he talked to people all the time. Yeah, I remember seeing him there used to be a joint in New York called the Peacock Cafe. And it was a place where you could go for a price of a cup of coffee and they let you sit there for 10 hours. They just didn't throw you out. And I would see him in there often with different intellectuals, different people from the arts, holding court, if you will, but sitting around a round table with 5 or 6 people and really going at it on the issues of the day. For him, ideas were tangible. He could hold them. He believed in what he was doing. And I have enormous respect for his work. But in terms of the trade union movement, we need 100 more like him. You know, kudos out to the comrades at Jacobin, because they continue at least to allow the trade union movement to have an arena where we can be taken seriously enough to be criticized, but also encouraged. And I'm just going to end that because if there's 1,500 people out there somewhere, they probably got something they want to say.
Thank you so much, Ed. We have a few questions from the audience already in the queue, but I want to encourage folks to contribute more. I'm also told that Cornell West is still available. Maybe he can respond to some of the questions because unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, we are short one speaker on this panel anyway, and that's Adolph Reed. And so it would be great to have another voice here. In fact, maybe I'll start with a question that Cornell is uniquely well positioned to answer, though maybe others will want to respond to it as well, which is this. If Stanley were alive today, what advice would he give to those in the labor movement to combat the toxic influence of white nationalism and white supremacy? Cornell, would you like to take a shot at that first, and then we can invite the other panelists to speak? I think you're on mute, Cornell, sorry.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, now we can.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I think one, that Stanley would never reduce whiteness to white supremacy because he knows there's a rich history of vanilla brothers and sisters fighting against white supremacy. Because he understood race not as a fetishized factor that transcends history, but as a historically contingent factor that depends on the kind of choices people make. So that he would accent the John Browns, the Vito Marcantonios, the Rabbi Heschels, the Ann Bradens, the white activists against white supremacy who are in genuine solidarity with the Frederick Douglasses and the Sojourner Truth. It's like Lydia Maria Child with David Walker, the white sister with the black. So that when you think about white supremacy, he would start with situate yourself in the same history as Miles Horton and other white activists who fight against white supremacy with genuine solidarity with black folk.
Thank you. Ed, would you like to speak to this question as well? You sort of touched on it in your remarks.
Yeah, I think Stanley. He did understand how complicated it was, and he did make a distinction between where the leadership was going. He lived through that period of the merger of the AFL-CIO and the decade after it, where questions of the civil rights movement were posed immediately to the trade union leadership. And if you look at some of his comments over the years on that, he understood, on the one hand, here was the head of the AFL-CIO, Brother George Meany, paying lip service to the Civil Rights Act and supporting it verbally, while every union, particularly on the skilled side of the unions and even in the needle trades, was in fact doing everything they can not to change a goddamn thing. And Stanley understood those things. But again, he never gave up the notion that elements of the class would see it in their best interest to go forward and to be brief about it and do the right thing. It remains a complicated question at the base. Here we are, all those years after George Wallace captures huge votes in the Democratic Party of white working class people. And here we are again in Trump, facing similar but very different conditions. The struggle remains, at least until very recently, a huge piece of the trade union leadership is under the desk. Now, there are bold elements and everybody's going, oh, what about this guy? What about that woman? And what? Yes, there's always been some people that stood up and we stay in solidarity with them. But he understood it as a complicated question. He respected the movement enough to struggle with it about it, which to me is the key part. But in the end, here we are again. And what are we going to do about it is still a question to be posed. The other thing I want to say is, You know, Stanley, in an odd way, was the voice for the 90% plus of workers that are not inside the unions. He raised the issues that the unions don't deal with. And if there's a legacy to go on here to the young labor activists, don't lose sight of that.
Thank you. Jamie, do you want to speak to this as well, or should we go on? What? Okay. Now there's a lot of questions suddenly in the chat. There's one more for Cornell, which I'm not sure I fully understand, but I'm sure you will. It goes like this: would you consider the organic intellectual, as you described, Stanley, before, to be at one with Sinclair Lewis's idea of the, quote, free, independent spirit and critical thinker?
Well, I mean, any intellectual has to have a strong self-critical and self-scrutinizing aspect in terms of who they are and how they behave. And so you're always, in one sense, in and out at the same time. You're inside, outside at the same time. And yet, in the end, you know, you're willing to not just take a stand, but really take a risk on behalf of the poor and working people that you're fighting with and alongside.
All right, the very first question that appeared from the audience is quite different and maybe not totally appropriate for this panel, but maybe some people will want to take a stab at it. And it was, what did Stanley think of Marcuse? I just want to start by saying that for me, Marcuse was a huge influence. Around the same time I read False Promises, I remember spending a whole semester reading Marcuse. And what I sort of figured out at that time was that the big problem of the 20th century, which was what it was at the time, for 20th century Marxism, was trying to understand why all the prophecies of socialist revolution had failed to come about. And for many of us, Marcuse was the great, you know, one of the great contributors to trying to understand that. Stanley wrote in False Promises, I just found a little mention of Marcuse there, where he says, writers like Herbert Marcuse have reminded us that in advanced capitalist societies, workers are more likely to remain part of the prevailing system than to turn against it. So in some ways, you can draw a straight line from that understanding that, you know, capitalist domination had permeated the population, and specifically the working class, to Stanley's perspective on labor. Anyway, I'm sure others have more to say on this topic. Maybe, Jamie, would you like to give it a try, or?
Sure, I can say a few things. I agree with everything you said, Ruth. You know, as Stanley was my professor for a number of times, and there is, I think, no intellectual figure that he talked more about than Marcuse, both his scholarly relationship with and his personal relationship with. I think he had a deep appreciation for his role in the Frankfurt School, and especially for Marcuse's role in helping to sort of foment the new left. And I think Stanley saw a lot of contradictions there, but the degree to which the new left overlapped with a kind of like dissident faction in the 70s working class, the Wildcat strikes, especially some of the Lordstown stuff, I think was really important to him. I know, I'm not sure what the questioner is thinking about. I know he also really appreciated Marcuse's reading of Hegel, Reason and Revolution, that book. He taught that as class in dialectics numerous times, and was, you know, super interested in the puzzle that Marcuse presents, which is this sort of, how do you resist if everything is co-opted from the inside? And that puzzle, I think, was at the heart of the problematic that Stanley dealt with in False Promises, in the Crisis of Historical Materialism, that I think he saw Marcuse as this, as you said, Ruth, this very important sort of pivot figure in identifying the weakness of sort of the prophecy of Marxism, so to speak.
Cornell, would you like to add to that?
You know, I was thinking of Stanley's last line in his great book on C. Wright Mills, where he says, who and where are the social agents of change C. Wright Mills never stopped asking that question. Never stopped asking that question. Who are the revolutionary agents? What collectivities can be pointed to? What formation? What are the conditions under which the emerging groups, agents are? That's Stanley's question. That's Marcuse's question. That's any serious progressive question, any serious revolutionary question. So he loved Marcuse. He loved Marcuse.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. It says, to Ed mostly, but maybe others will want to speak to it as well. What did the New York City labor leadership think about Stanley? You did speak to that, as did Joe, a little bit. How can we heal that divide in which Stanley, the great organic labor intellectual, is dismissed by labor? I'm not sure that's accurate, but you'll say. As a past student of Stanley at the Graduate Center, a union organizer, I find those worlds do not mesh well. Ed, would you like to give that a stab, and then we'll invite others?
I want to tell you a story, because I would dismiss may be the wrong word. Earlier today, I think it was Cornell, he raised, Stanley ran for governor on the Green Party. During that time, I was the political director of the Central Labor Council in New York City. Our president at that time, who was a guy named Mccallum, some of you may know, we had Stanley come in. Actually, it was the only time I ever saw Stanley in a suit and tie. And he played the game, but he came in, and the thing that was interesting to me was how many of the people at that table, and let me tell you, this was not a left of center social democratic group. This was a lot of building trades people and a lot of very, very conservative public sector union leaders. They all knew who Stanley was, and they were all very aware of Stanley's critique. And some of them were loaded for bear. Stanley came in and he made a presentation about the issues of the day. He did not come in and offer a critique of the Central Labor Council, but it was an implied critique in that he talked about the issues facing the people of New York that were not being responded to, that necessitated him to make this run, knowing he would not win, knowing he would not get many votes. But they were very aware of him. They did not dismiss him. When he left that room, he got begrudging respect, but the challenge would have been dropped down. The only other person I ever saw do that with the Central Labor Council was Reverend Al Sharpton, who came into the Central Labor Council, and he opened the meeting by saying, some of you I've helped publicly and some of you I've helped secretly. Now let's talk. It was an interesting moment, but Stanley, the thing that impressed me that day, Stanley needed no introduction. They knew who he was. Many of them considered him an enemy. Others of them considered him a pain in the ass. And some of them really respected him and had been influenced by him. But so he wasn't dismissed in that way. How do we overcome the divide? We overcome the divide. And I spent 50 years in the labor movement saying I was the heretic within. We overcome that by working and forcing us to work with broader movements. We've been anti-immigrant since we became a movement of immigrants. It's one of the great contradictions of the trade union movement in this country. We have been ambivalent at best on questions of civil rights and civil liberties, unless they directly affect us. We need to build a broader movement, and we need to allow space for workers to organize as they see what organization they need. As I used to say to my students who were very frustrated, there are other movements. There are other movements. We need to constantly talk. I spent 10 years at the Central Labor Council arguing that we needed to build dignified and respectful relationships with the movements of immigrants. I ended up at the university.
You know, all of us in labor studies spend time negotiating this great divide because there is a lot of, suspicion on both sides. A lot of labor people who think academics have these, we do have very privileged lives and that we don't really get what the struggles of workers are all about. And then there are many academics who look down on labor officials as, well, you know, critical of their incorporation into the system in the way Stanley wrote about. And so there's always that tension. And yet many people, Stanley probably better than almost anyone, try to negotiate that divide and figure out how to, you know, make it work. I don't know, Jamie, as somebody who worked for some years as an organizer and then entered academia, if you want to comment on this question.
I think it's a really great question. Like I worked at SEIU for a while too, and the people that I worked with knew Stanley, and they sort of, as Ed said, they sort of had this begrudging respect because Stanley raised the long-term vision, strategic issues that were hard to deal with from a lot of labor leaders who had to deal with the campaign right in front of them, right? How many votes do we have for this election? And Stanley was unconcerned with that question in his work, right? And in his scholarly work. And I think at times there was, you know, I think that question suggests that there's this way in which, well, of course, we sort of agree on one hand, but we have this, you know, these bread and butter issues to deal with that are right in front of us. And Stanley was, I think, frustrated with that divide, but also as an organizer and an activist, I mean, a leader within the PSC, was familiar with some of those tensions. So as to how to, I mean, I don't know how to get around it, but I do think that you know, there is probably a role for sympathetic, labor-friendly intellectuals to play in the labor movement in ways that we don't play right now. And I think that trying to meld those worlds together is probably, you know, is a good idea, actually, for all of us.
Cornell, do you want to add anything? I don't know about how much involved you've been in the labor movement, but you're certainly someone who, as an intellectual, participates actively in all kinds of other movements. And I think some of the tensions are the same.
Yeah, I think it has something to do with Brother Stanley's spirit. You know, he had such a sense of humanity, a sense of humor, to laugh at himself, to be able to move in and out of context with being at ease in his skin, so he doesn't come in insecure and either. I mean, he could come across arrogant sometimes, but it's just because he was just so confident, and yet that the next moment he's confident, he's also self-critical. So he had this wonderful sense of human fallibility and incongruity. And Stanley could be a walking contradiction like all of us, you know what I mean? And he would laugh at that contradiction and incongruity. So there's ways in which, I know Brother Ed's got this same sense of this wonderful personality. People can just see your humanity, and so they're not going to just confine you to just a political perspective. You can bounce back and forth in that way. And Stanley had that. That's a rare thing. It's just a something. It's almost like a Ray Charles solo. You know, you can't really pin it down, but he got a something in his soul that opens people.
That's very well said. All right, here's another question from the audience. With regard to workers getting their time back, I think this is basically for Jamie, though I'm not sure if the whoever wrote it knows that. With regard to workers getting their time back, could we see the labor movement change the default 40-hour work week to something significantly less that still affords workers good and secure lives?
I'd like to struggle with that for a little bit because time is a question. It wasn't just about the work week, and I think Jamie mentioned that earlier. The control of time is actually directly related to the power that you actually have over your own life. And the whole working class movement, going back to the beginnings of capitalism, that struggle for the control of time. It wasn't just how long we work, but it goes right down to the question of what we work on, what we choose to work on, how long we choose to work on it, and what is the quality of our working life. This question of time, which honestly, outside of the traditional collective bargaining, wages, hours, and working conditions. And I remember hearing Stanley talking about that. If that's what you're dealing with, you're missing a whole lot. This question of time is extremely complicated. It goes from birth to death. It goes to the spirit of how we engage, and it goes to what we believe we actually are in society. Our humanity is wrapped up in that question, and we're not close to solving it, but it's suicide, spiritual suicide, if you will, never mind material suicide, to not engage it. And we have to figure that out. I spent more time in the classroom talking about time than I did about collective bargaining.
Jamie literally wrote a book about this question, so maybe you'd like to add something. Yeah.
I think it's a great question. It was the question I was interested in from my book. You know, there's someone on this in this conference right now who is leading the movement to abolish the 24-hour workday in New York City, right? Like there are caregivers, home health aides who work 24-hour shifts who are paid for 13. It's illegal. It's legal. When you go to SEIU and say, SEIU, these people are members, we need to do something about this, they don't get it. And there is a way in which the fight over hours has a little over the years, which was the original mission of the labor movement, right? The 10-hour day, the 8-hour day, hopefully the 6-hour day has sort of been abandoned on other issues. And winning that back, I think is very important. There's always these people who are interested in the kind of like legislation over the 4-day work week. Fine, I think it's interesting. Local fights like the one in New York right now to abolish the 24-hour workday, I think are more interesting because they can easily involve segments of the labor movement that aren't fully engaged with it yet. So just as a plug, I'm sort of marginally involved in that campaign. It's the Ain't I a Woman campaign. You can look it up. To abolish the 24-hour workday is really important. There are questions now around the labor movement, especially around fair scheduling, which are really not about ending time, but controlling it, like when people are scheduled and that kind of thing, which is a really important development. So I think there's inklings of movements around the control of time in the labor movement right now. But I do think, the pandemic, frankly, I don't think we've said that word yet. The pandemic has really put that back on the table as work weeks went crazy early in the pandemic, like both wildly up and down. And that, variability and sort of schizophrenia, I think has permeated a lot of American society. And the degree to which there's impetus for a shorter hours movement now has in some ways never been greater. So I do think it's a really important thing to put our agenda. I'm sorry.
There's also, other pieces of this that I'm sure our listeners are aware of. I've done a little bit of research on the gig economy and interviewed some gig workers, and the appeal of that work to workers, which many people on the left dismiss as, oh, they're just suckers or something. In fact, it's often an illusion, but the idea, the promise that's put out by those companies that you can control your own schedule. People are deeply attracted to that. I remember interviewing one woman who worked as a Instacart delivery person. And prior to that, she had worked at Whole Foods. And she said, why should I let someone else set my schedule when I can do this? And she had other complaints about the job. It's not technically a job, the Instacart work, but that was what kind of got her there in the first place. And so I think we see not only in, organized forms of, the shorter work week and fair work week and all those, the home care workers campaign that Jamie just mentioned and so on. Aside from that, there's just in ordinary working people, a deep desire to reclaim control over their time. And I think you're absolutely right in the money that the pandemic has really accelerated that. So speaking of the pandemic, there's another question, which is a little different. And I don't know what people are going to want to say, but I want to pose it from the audience, which is how would Stanley have critiqued the delivery of worker education instruction on Zoom as a result of COVID? Maybe Joe would like to talk to that since you've not participated yet in this conversation since the presentations.
It's a mixed situation. We have about 50,000 workers under our umbrella, and March 14, 2020, we closed down and moved to a blend. No, we didn't move to online. And moved online because it was vital that we had to stay in touch with residents and workers. It was vital that they needed information that we had the ability to provide, like unemployment insurance, health, where to get your test, eviction questions, etc., and how to get food. And that was okay. That was good. When you were home in June without a job and no chances for a worry about health and money and housing, it was vital to be able to talk to somebody. The Zoom was not a problem. What was a problem was our ability to deliver it from time to time. We needed to take collective instruction around the city on how to use it. And some of our resident members had problems because they didn't have the right technology. But the reality is it was a wonderful chance to stay in the game. It was a wonderful chance to stay connected. Those workers needed somebody to talk to. They needed, well, our phrase was you have to touch your constituents. Now, Ruth, as it comes further into the possibility of gathering together, we realize the value of the interpersonal, the value of the social, the value of the fact that 15 people in the same room. Underestimated in all of workforce development is that workers are the best teachers of workers. And we go out of our way to say, you got to elect a member as a mentor. You have to elect a member as a co-teacher. You have to elect a member as whatever subject. So that the ability to get together is vital. And I've heard you talk about the whole question about the university having online versus and that kind of thing. What we are now, the language we're now using is we want to blend. And that goes for the construction unions that can get together more often, more conveniently. The home care workers, $11.99, the healthcare workers, the CNAs don't have to travel from the Bronx to our place at 83 Main or their place at 43rd Street. And so I can go home, I can take care of my kids, and I can get online. And this is not sunrise semester. We have gone out of our way to make it interpersonal. So I think that we're heading towards starting in the second week of January. What do you want to do? We'll do both.
And here at SLU, we have the same conversation more or less. I remember at the very beginning of in spring 2020, when our classes all switched to online from being in person, which wasn't as bad as what followed because we had all met each other and interacted in person prior to that switch. So we, people were comfortable with each other and could read some of the on-screen body language a little better. And I remember students saying that, in the chaos of the beginnings of the pandemic, that this was something they knew they could count on every week or whenever it was, that this was, and they all showed up. It was extraordinary. I do think over time, as you said, Joe, it changed and people became, especially in classes where nobody had ever met anybody before in the flesh, so to speak, and they just were dealing with Zoom. That created a lot of problems. And aside from the technical problems, just a sense that it was a kind of degraded form of learning, although certainly much better than nothing. Imagine if we had not had Zoom and we just had to shut down completely. Certainly it was better than that. And now we're all struggling with, but none of us have really addressed what was Stanley upset about this. It's hard to know. I think he would have had his usual cutting edge, critique of all the problems with it, and at the same time tried to struggle with it and make it work, which is what I guess we're all trying to do. So hopefully those days will soon be behind us and we'll have some freedom to figure out an appropriate mix of these two modalities, but we're not quite there yet. All right, we are almost out of time. So what I would like to do with the remaining 5 minutes that we have is just invite each of you to say a few closing words. And then maybe we'll end with Cornell, who wasn't officially part of this panel, but I'm sure has some parting words he'd like to share. So why don't we just go in the order in which you spoke, and just a minute each, okay? Because we are almost out of time. Jamie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just say that, as others have said, Stanley is, was a path-breaking scholar in labor studies. And I think his work has probably been underappreciated. I think he thought it was underappreciated. And I think there's been this moment now in the last couple of months, weeks really, since his passing, when we can reevaluate some of those questions. And having gone back to his work over the past couple of weeks has really showed me, how insightful and how important it was. And I think that's been, as scholars and activists, we all have this opportunity to do that now, and we should take it. So thanks for everyone for being here.
Thank you. Joe, do you want to say a few words in closing remarks?
My tale for those 20 minutes was really a kind of, little gathering that Stanley and I had together, but it produced tremendous results in terms of my understanding of what my obligation was. I'm grateful. I can't pick up false promise. Jamie's description was so wonderful. I can't pick up even the jobless future and the introduction to whatever the life and death of American labor without getting something out of it. But I can't think of what my obligation and what Ed and I are trying to do with workers and the strength of workers as a historian now going forward with James Parrott's wonderful study of what the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic, on Astoria. We got our hands on large numbers of workers who are waiting for something to happen. And I want to thank Stanley for putting it to me. As a good Catholic, I hope to go to heaven. I don't go to confession, so I'm not a good Catholic. But the reality is I'm a good follower of my mentors, and Stanley Aronowitz has really given me instructions of what my obligation is.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, look, to me, Stanley, it's a legacy. There's a lot of people here today for a reason. He, to me, was kind of, and I'm not saying I agree with everything he said, that'd be ridiculous. But he was, to me, the perfect mix of an activist, a scholar, and a leader. And we didn't talk about that on this panel. Hopefully people will later, but there's a whole lot of people that he was the beacon that they could look to. And once you understood what Stanley did, you could measure where you stood. And that's an enormous contribution to an activist because we very rarely get closure on our work. And having those people out there that allow you to measure progress and defeat was really important. And he was a model to me. And I'm gonna miss him. But however I finish out the next phase of my life, I hope I can do 1/10 of the things that he did.
Thank you. Cornell, you get the last word.
I think Brother Ed has said it so eloquently, I must say. But I think it's important to keep in mind, Stanley, he's born in 1933. The book comes out in 1973. He writes the classic in his late 30s. In many ways, it's even prior to him finishing up his dissertation. He's the real thing when it comes to the life of the mind, because whether he goes through a college or graduate school, 2 colleges and 2 graduate schools are going to go through him, because he's committed to the life of the mind one way or another. Autodidact, formalized, informalized. He's continually learning. He's continually bringing in new perspective. That's Socratic at the deepest level, and he's prophetic at the deepest level, because he's got a hypersensitivity to the suffering of the weak and the vulnerable. And he doesn't just talk about it, he's gonna do something about it. He says what he means what he says, and follows through with that smile and with that style. That's what makes him a vanilla blues man. He's a vanilla blues man because he's forever sensitive to the suffering, forever responding to the suffering with style, with a smile, and empowering all of us. That's why we love our brother.
Thank you so much. That is like the perfect ending to this conversation. I really appreciate it. Okay, we are out of time. I want to just make a couple housekeeping announcements. There is a lunch break in the conference from now until 1 p.m. But during that time, if you want to eat your lunch in front of your screen, there will be some slides projected on the screen, as well as a 20-minute video of Stanley speaking at the Left Forum some years back that you may want to have a look at. And then we'll resume the official proceedings of the conference at 1 o'clock sharp. So please, I know we can't really clap, but please join me in thanking all our panelists, and thank you all for coming to listen. Hopefully next time in person. Okay, thanks so much.